So the talk is about a revolution for learning. Now, when we talk about a revolution for learning, I think from the panelists, the goal was to have a digital revolution for learning, but I'll actually talk about a very different revolution for learning, which is one based on learning science. So, over the past 50 years, we've learned a tremendous amount about what helps people learn, and what my hope is that you will get out of this talk is that people can learn much more rapidly than in the past. We know a lot about this topic, and we're not applying it. And we'll explore some of the reasons why we're not applying it. So, over the history of education, up to about 1950, what we knew about learning came from educational philosophers. The first of these in Western culture were Socrates, who believed on drawing information out of learners, Aristotle, who believed in repetition and a top-down approach, Thomas Aquinas, who tried to bridge ancient Greek thinking with medieval philosophy, Locke, who came up with what eventually became critical reasoning, and Dewey, who thought about social learning and how learning impacts democracy and civic society. And educators would basically pick and choose ideas from philosophers like this, but we really didn't know which of these worked and which of these didn't work. What started to happen around 1950 is we started conducting very rigorous experiments on how people learn. This is one of the canonical papers from this period from Bloom in 1984. What Bloom looked at was a technique known as mastery learning, where the concept is that you basically learn material for as long as you need to master it, and then you move on. So you don't leave knowledge gaps by spending too little time, and you don't waste time once you've learned something. And what Bloom found, and many follow-up studies found, was this led to gains in learning of about 1 to 2 standard deviations. 2 standard deviations means that a student would outperform 95% of students in a traditional setting. So this sort of continued, well, it continues to today, but there was another change that happened sort of in the late 90s where we started to see large-scale meta-studies where we looked at papers like Bloom, we looked across many classrooms, and we saw what helped learning. This is a paper from Hockey in 1998, which looked at over 6,000 students in over 60 classrooms, and found that when you switched to interactive engagement techniques, learning gains more than doubled. Learning gains is a methodology that controls for prior knowledge and looks at how much of what people don't know they are learning. And learning gains in conventional settings were about 0.23. In interactive engagement settings were about 0.48. Now, there's many ways to get interactive engagement. I can give you clickers where, as I talk, you answer questions. I can put you in small peer groups where you work together. On problems. I can put you in project-based settings. I can go with blended settings where you're working through material in computers with computers giving you feedback, but fundamentally you're manipulating information. So that led to a more than doubling of learning. At that point, in the late 90s and early 2000s, we started seeing people compile everything we know about learning into books like these. Visible Learning came from the National Academy of Science. A collection of experts came together and compiled how people learn came from the National Academy of Science, and it was a compendium of essentially everything we knew with high levels of rigor about how people learn. Visible Learning is a lifetime project of Haiti and Yates, where they've read thousands of research papers and looked at effect sizes, which things help people learn and which things hurt learning. And this is a massive table that you would find on Haiti's webpage that looks at the effect sizes of around 200 interventions in learning. So the way that I designed the edX platform is I basically picked out interventions that, first of all, led to big effect sizes, and second of all, were easy to implement. So these were things like mastery learning, which I talked about, immediate feedback, which when a person makes a mistake, it should be remediated immediately. support for self-regulated learning, letting students develop tools to control their own learning, interventions if there are knowledge gaps or misconceptions, fairly authentic assessment. There's a whole collection of these that it goes on for a while, but as you put these together, you actually do see pretty big gains in learning. Our first randomized control trial was at San Jose State University, where we tried to use an MIT course for a population that was much more disadvantaged. And that was their electronics course typically had a very high failure rate. Sorry, this is the wrong version of the presentation for some reason. But we saw learning gains go from 59%, sorry, we saw course completion rates go from about 59% to about 91%. So we saw a tremendous improvement in student learning outcomes. That's not unique. When Khan Academy did something similar 5 years prior, they also, actually, sorry, 3 years prior, they saw similar outcomes. When they implemented this at a high school in Los Altos for in a blended learning setting for a group of very disadvantaged students, none of these students were advanced. A few were far below basic. All of the students basically moved up. Some moved into the advanced bin, some moved from far below basic into basic, and there was a very large gain in learning. So we're sort of seeing this happen pretty consistently. And as I said, it's not just blended learning. It's group-based learning. It's project-based learning. It's essentially any of these formats, whether based on the science of learning. We also have similar techniques for group work, for critical problem solving, mathematical maturity, for much more complex skills. And what we found is that we've had a tremendous number of these trials where learning goes way up. In many cases, we replicate it across many classrooms, but it never hits scale. So today, 80% of edX courses rely on multiple choice questions, very simple assessments together with lecture videos. Almost all university courses are still in lecture formats, and only a few K-12 schools use modern techniques, despite them showing very large gains in learning. So the question is, why? In the United States, if you look at the K-12 system, we have parents select school boards hire administrators, administrators hire teachers, and teachers teach students. Teachers go through schools of education, which in traditional academic silos continue the same fields that were taught in schools of education for a very long time and focus on educational policy, educational philosophy, and not on the science of learning. Parents and school boards are generally not qualified to look at this either. There are no incentives in the system for better learning. So we still see traditional classrooms. In universities are motivated by prestige. Hiring is primarily based, or almost entirely based, on quality of research. Professors are subject matter experts with no background in teaching and learning, and there are very rarely incentives at universities to measure how students learn. Where there are incentives are based on student surveys, which don't really correlate with learning. Student surveys, you primarily want students to be happy. You do that with high clarity of presentation. Good learning involves a lot of confusion. Students tend to be conservative. If you change formats, students complain. That hurts you both if parents complain to school boards and in university settings with surveys. There are no incentives in the system to see better learning. So universities are still almost entirely lecture formats. With MOOC providers, the motivation is primarily profit. Profit you get by having many students. Many students you get by having a large variety of courses. That pushes towards short, cheap, simplistic courses, since students have no way of evaluating before they take a course which course is effective and which one is not. Even once they're in a course, in many cases, they don't. So, typical MOOC, multiple choice questions, and lecture videos. We do have a large number of very high quality MOOCs, but there's no way to find them. We have probably a few hundred of those at this point. In industry, people try to check off regulatory checklists, and so on and so forth. As we go field by field, we find that there aren't incentives in place for good teaching and learning. And so The key incentives that are in place around certifications. Students want to receive degrees. There are some incentives around perceptions of learning, which, as I said, are very different from learning. Measurement in education is hard. In education, we can test simple procedural knowledge, we can test memorization easily. More complex skills, which we care about, which we've spoken about tremendously, are much harder to test. So we rely on substantive and theoretical arguments. Education is also a long process. It's a 17-year process. And so any particular experience has a small measurable impact on outcomes. So it's very hard to measure the things we actually care about. So that's sort of where I want to, in some sense, leave this talk, is with a question for you, for the people in this room. How do we put in appropriate incentives in place so we can actually take teaching and learning to the next level? If we can have just a 30% gain in student learning, that translates to high school students finishing the equivalent of bachelor's degrees, college students finishing the equivalent of doctorates. That's a very big societal impact. We've known how to do this for some number of years. We haven't gotten there. And I hope that in this panel we can just explore a little bit how we go from traditional lecture-based formats to more innovative formats. Right now I'm pursuing an initiative that's trying to do this to some extent, that's focusing on soft skills, that's focusing a lot on evidence-based practice there, as well as on places where incentives can align. But I think that's a separate talk, and I think I'll pass it on to
We're done already?
Well, we sort of said we'd shorten. I can keep going for a little bit about
okay.
So we had a discussion beforehand where we planned to shorten our talks from 20
yeah.
minutes to 10 or 15, so we'd have more time for discussion.
Okay, I think a shorter is better in some way, but you have more time to, for our discussion.
I'm happy to talk longer if you really want.
Later on. Okay, thank you so much for your nice presentation, and